morning I'd like to pick up on a question that we touched on briefly last Sunday, and that is it possible to be a worshiping congregation in isolation? Now, I enjoy seeing other churches online right now. I can go back in the afternoon, read through the comments on our live stream, and check out what others are doing. Mac does a great live stream. It's great to see Pastor Chris and his wife, who's a good friend of our church, up there singing, and Covenant's doing some good stuff. All kinds of churches around us are live streaming, and it's amazing to see the pastors preach and the musicians do their music. And so if you're a church hopper, you can church hop through 8 or 9 churches in a day. So that's pretty fantastic. But as I watch all these live streams, I have to ask myself the question, is that worship? Is it worship if we don't do it in the same room? Now, today, I would like to suggest that quarantine has taught us that we can worship God anywhere, anytime, any way. I read this week that in the foyer of a church, a young boy was looking at the plaques on the wall, and the plaques had the names of men and women who had died in various wars. In fact, we have one in the sanctuary of the very same type. And the young boy asked the pastor, he said, "Well, Reverend, who are these people?" And the pastor said, "Well, these are members of our church who died in the service." And the young boy looked very upset with the news, and he said, "Well, Pastor, was it the early service or the second service?" I'm sure you're laughing out there. I can't hear it, but I know you are. Well, we don't have to worry about falling asleep in a pew anymore, because now we can fall asleep in our PJs at home on the couch. And because I've never participated in a live stream, not actually live from your end, I don't really know what it's like. I think it probably is super weird to be on your end of all of this, because I know it's really weird to be on my end of all of this, to preach to a little rectangle on my camera. It's so weird. It must be weird for you. And yet, it does prove, what we're doing right now does prove that we can worship God anywhere. And we know this, right? We know we can worship God anywhere. Intellectually, we've read passages like Acts 7 that says the Most High, that's God, does not live in houses made by human hands. As the prophet says, "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me?" So we know intellectually with our minds that the idea that we have to come to a building to worship God is just a weird idea that few of us would support, and yet we kind of live that way, don't we? Until recently, haven't we kind of just created this whole system built around Sunday morning worship? I mean, when you tell someone that you went to church, what do they picture in their mind? You got in your car, you drove to a building, and you gathered in a room on Sunday morning with other believers. I mean, just our whole faith seems to be wrapped around this central core group gathering on Sunday mornings for an hour or an hour and a quarter. As a pastor of 20 years, I can tell you that people have grown very comfortable having this service provided for them, and they can have some pretty strong opinions on how this service, this product, is brought to them. But quarantine has taught us that worship can happen anywhere, in your living room, in the car, or, as I am often reminded by Fred Hacker, on a boat. But you know, it's always been this way. Our God has always been a traveling God. Back in the day, like way, way back in Old Testament times, the way people thought of the gods is regional. Now we have this idea God is over everything. He's the creator of the universe. But a lot of the times the gods were a lot smaller. Far bigger than humans, but smaller than the idea of God that we have today. And so there would be a reigning God over Midland, and the people of Midland would have a central temple. And if there was a rival god, maybe they have a rival temple, and that god would be the god of this area. And generally, gods didn't travel. But what we find in the Old Testament is that God traveled a lot. He didn't stay in one area and just kind of put down roots and say, these are my 20,000 people, this is all I care about, the rest of the world is someone else's problem. I mean, just think about the Exodus, for example. And a little bit of it is on the screen behind me. What did God do when his people cried out? They were in slavery and they needed help. He heard their cry, the Old Testament tells us. And what did he do? He went out into an unknown place out in the wilderness where Moses is hiding, grabs Moses, brings him back to Egypt, leads the people out of Egypt into the wilderness, and then leads them to the promised land. And we read in Exodus 13 that as they traveled through the wilderness, by day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. What a powerful image. As these people, frightened and scared, navigating the wilderness with their former captors behind them on their heels, not knowing what is going to happen, God is right at the forefront, leading them and guiding them and never forsaking them, because God is a traveling God. We are the spiritual descendants of the Exodus. And so our God goes before us as a pillar of cloud and fire. And so knowing this, we know that we can worship our God anywhere. Now that one's pretty easy. That's kind of a no-brainer. We can also worship God anytime. It makes sense that if we can worship God anywhere, that we can also worship him anytime. The Apostle Paul even exhorts us to rejoice always, to pray continually, to give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. And so we know that since we can worship God anywhere, we can worship him anytime, and we don't need to wait for this hour on Sunday morning to worship our great God. And this is a fact that I'm often reminded of by all of my golfer parishioners as they let me know that they will not be there on Sunday morning in July because it is golf season and they'll be worshiping God out on the links. Which leads me to another story that I heard this week. I read a story about a golfer who met an angel, and they struck up a conversation. And of course, this golfer, being an avid fan of the sport, asked the angel, well, are there any golf courses in heaven? And the angel said, well, I've got good news for you and I've got bad news. And the golfer said, well, what's the good news? And the angel said, there are golf courses in heaven that are so beautiful you can't even fathom them. They make the best golf courses here on earth look like garbage. And the golfer said, well, that is amazing news. What could be bad in any of that? And of course the angel said, well, I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have a tea time tomorrow at 8:30 in the morning. I want to be clear that what I'm talking about is not an excuse to skip church or what we call church for that hour on Sunday morning. I think it's really important that we do gather together when we are able for encouragement, for mutual support, and just to lift up our voices to God together in harmony, in worship, in praise, in adoration. What I'm talking about is an awareness that God is so great and so mighty and so omnipresent that I cannot limit my worship to 1 hour a week, nor can you. You know, I'm often encouraged when I'm able to visit my seniors where they live, whether it's on their own or whether it's in one of our wonderful retirement homes. And it's been months since I've been allowed to do that, and hopefully I'll be able to get reacquainted with some of them soon. But you know, one of the things that always encourages me is when I go and visit them in their room, they'll have their favorite chair all set up. There's usually a TV across the way, maybe a radio, and there'll almost always be a Bible and a notepad and a pen and maybe a daily bread or another similar devotional beside them. Like when I go and visit Aileen Wallace, a wonderful dear old saint, I know that there's going to be a Bible right there, and she's going to tell me about what she read that morning. She has an awareness that even though she hasn't been to church in months, she can still worship God anywhere, anytime. And to me, that is so encouraging. I know that for some of our people, they see their acts of service as a means of worship. Like I watch Randy Hargrave come, and he and Vernice set up on Tuesday mornings giving out sandwiches. And I know that for these two, what they're doing is an act of worship. It's an act of worship. And also, have you ever driven by Nancy Charlebois when she's driving? You're going to see her singing her heart out, worshiping God in the car. Because worship can happen anywhere, anytime. And I think that this is proof as well that we can worship God any way. If we can worship God anytime and anywhere, why can't we worship Him in any way? Now, let's be honest and admit that we often get locked into doing worship a certain way. You know, the early Lutherans thought that any instrument was of the devil, and so all of their singing was a cappella. Some of our Reformed traditions come out of that, which might be why we have such a hard time expressing ourselves in worship as Presbyterians. Some churches still feel this way about drums, that drums are from the devil, and I know that many of you would disagree. And, you know, we kind of get locked into patterns here as well. With Presbyterians, it's usually about 5 hymns, 3 prayers, and 1 sermon. And hopefully none of them are too long. So we get locked into certain ways of doing our worship. Now, I love it when worship incorporates all kinds of instruments. After all, Psalm 33 encourages us, as we read, to employ all different kinds of instruments as we sing joyfully to the Lord, as we praise Him with the harp and the lyre, and we play skillfully, and we even shout for joy. When I say that we can worship God any way, I mean it more in the fact that worshiping God with bass guitar in didgeridoo or whatever instrument you use is not necessarily what I'm talking about. I love using different methods, but what I mean is this: we can worship God anyway, because even when things are tough, we can worship our God anyway. Have you ever read the book of Habakkuk? Habakkuk is a fun one to say. I recommend the book. You should check it out sometime. Habakkuk is a book in the Old Testament. He's a prophet in the Old Testament who had been through a lot of hard knocks. He was a struggler who didn't find it easy to believe. He had a lot of questions. He was even ready to challenge God about some of his perplexities. But in spite of all of his doubts and worries and fears and everything else going on, what I like about the prophet Habakkuk is that he had a strong faith. He had the kind of faith that had been tested out in the real world. Now listen to what he says. He says, though the fig tree does not bud, and no fruit is on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and the fields produce no food, though the sheep are cut off from the fold, and no cattle are in the stalls, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Now, notice that Habakkuk is not saying to us, hey, you people out there, I know things are tough, but just go ahead and worship God anyway. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, listen, I've had it tough. I've had my struggles. I've had my fears. I've had my doubts. I've had garbage happen to me. And yet in the midst of it all, even if I don't understand it, I am going to raise my voice in praise. This is the kind of personal witness that he is just pouring forth for all the world to see. This is how he feels. This is how he's going to face what life brings him. He will exult in the Lord. He will rejoice in the God of his salvation. And this leads me to ask, how do I face the challenges that come my way? Do I respond with trust and worship? Or do I only worship God when I feel like he's blessing me in the way that I want him to bless me? How about you? Do you ever find it is difficult to worship God, to give him praise when things in your life are not turning out the way you would want them to turn out? I like what Eugene Peterson says when he writes that worship is an act that develops feelings for God, not a feeling for God that is expressed in an act of worship. You see, situations change, feelings change, emotions come and go, but what is always constant is our Lord Jesus Christ, our God the Father, and our Holy Spirit. Our God, 3 in 1, never changes. His love never runs dry. His forgiveness is always abundant. And so we always have a reason to rejoice, to praise, to give glory, even if everything else around us is not lifting our emotions to want to do so. You know, I've gone through some hard times of my own. I've faced moments where it just seemed like life was not worth living. And I know many of you have been there too. And yet I would arrive here on a Sunday morning and I would walk through that door into the sanctuary and I would hear the praise team warming up and practicing their songs, the chatter of the greeters at the back. And I would just take a deep breath as I entered that space. And I realized that the next hour was going to get me through the next week. Because in that hour, I would gather with my brothers and sisters and worship God. Well, today I can't necessarily gather with you in that same way. But when I go through and I read the comments later and I see the people that popped in to say hi, who are gathered with us in worship, I have that same sense of solidarity and support. But more importantly, I join the great cloud of witnesses who I know in that hour were worshiping God together, even as you worship God throughout the week. And so, I think when it comes to our original question, is it possible to be a worshiping congregation in isolation? I think I have the answer. When we ask the question, is it worship if we don't do it in the same room? I think we have to stop and say, indeed it is. Because we can worship God anywhere, anytime, and we can do it anyway. And I think that we are proving that our congregation is just as strong, if not even stronger, than it was 4 months ago. We may not worship in the same room, but we worship the same God and we share the same faith. You know, I always thought that when we talked about the congregation, we were talking about the people who congregated in the same place. But what it really means, as it turns out, that congregating in this context means that we gather around the same gospel and the same Lord. And so I've had to redefine things in my head. I think, dear church, so long as we pause wherever we might be under the name of Jesus Christ and ascribe all glory, honor, and praise to the Lord our God, well, that's worship. And we are united by something far stronger than a common building or a common space. We are united by our faith in our God, who is anywhere or everywhere, anytime or all of the time. And he does it anyway, just because he loves us. Let us pray.